Okay, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today, if only virtually, to discuss one of Chicago's best ideas, namely Professor David Stauss's arguments that he made in a 1994 Columbia Law Review article about campaign finance law and their relationship to corruption and equality. Now, this is, I think, a very interesting time to be thinking about corruption, equality, and how we fund political speech in our system because I think there are two defining features of American politics in this era. So, on the one hand, there is growing awareness by among many people of how unequal our society is, both politically and economically, and socially as well. And there's also, on the other hand, widespread concern that our political system is broken, that it is not democratically responsive in the way that it should be. And so, and one might say that it is, in some senses, corrupt. And as I imagine most of you know, the amount of money that gets spent on political campaigning in this country only continues to grow with each election cycle. So the 2020 election, the federal election, was the most expensive in US history, with something like $14 billion spent on all federal campaigns. Given all this, the questions that Professor Stone posed in the article, an article entitled Corruption, Equality, and Campaign Finance Reform, namely, what are the good reasons to enact campaign finance regulations? And more specifically, how should concerns about mitigating the effects of money or economic inequality motivate these laws versus concerns about corruption? These questions remain as timely today as they were when Professor Stauss published the article about 25 years ago. And in some respects, I think they're even more timely today. So, in my talk today, I'm first going to summarize the arguments that Professor Stauss made in that article, then talk about some criticisms of it, then suggest some of its contemporary implications, and then open it up to your questions and comments. I know Zoom can be hard to concentrate on Zoom, so I'm going to try and keep my presentation relatively short and engaging. I have slides, and at some points, I'm going to ask for your participation. And I'm eager to hear your questions. So if you have lots of questions or any questions, please let me hear them in the Q&A. Okay. So, but to understand the argument, you first need to understand a little bit of campaign finance law. So in the chat, will you put up your hands, your Zoom hands, if you've taken free speech law, First Amendment law? Nope. Okay. So, all right. So, okay. So I think to understand the argument, you need to understand a little bit about the case Buckley v. Vallejo, which, although handed down in 1976, remains one of the most important campaign finance decisions in the First Amendment canon. So Buckley dealt with a First Amendment challenge to the Federal Elections Campaign Act of 1971, and it was amended in 1974. And this was a campaign finance law that Congress passed in the wake of the Watergate scandal, and during a period, I think like our own, in which there was widespread concern about the influence of money on politics and its distorting or corrupting effects. Now, as the DC Circuit Court of Appeals put it in the opinion in which it voted to uphold the law, to understand the act, you have to understand the 1972 election. This is the election that led to or preceded the Watergate scandal and the shock of its aftermath. It led to a call for comprehensive corrective measures. Congress found that federal election campaigns had become enormously expensive, with costs increasing at an alarming rate. These are quotes from the legislative history. Congress found, in the words of the House report, that the unchecked rise in campaign expenditures, coupled with the absence of limitations on contributions and expenditures, has increased the dependence of candidates on special interest groups and large contributors. And under the present law, the impression persists that a candidate can buy an election by simply spending large sums in a campaign. Now, the Congress also noted, when it was arguing for this law, that by 1974, 1% of the people in America accounted for something like 90% of the dollars contributed to federal candidates for election. And just 2 to 3% of the wealthiest people in the country were responsible for about 95% of the financing for congressional elections. Now, I couldn't get comparable figures today, but the problem of wealthy people dominating or contributing a great deal to fund elections clearly hasn't gone away. This is data taken from the federal elections campaign that just charts the contributions that billionaires in the US provided as a percentage of total federal campaign contributions. And here we're talking about several dozen people who are contributing. And the increase from the early 2000s until recently is pretty significant and pretty startling, and suggests that these concerns that Congress had when it enacted FECA, the Federal Elections Campaign Act, continue to be concerns we should have today. Okay, so in an effort to limit the ability of a few wealthy people to buy, quote unquote, buy the election, Congress imposed pretty steep limits on how much individuals could contribute in a given year to a federal candidate for federal political office, their campaign, and also how much they could spend in a given year independent of the campaign on election-related speech in favor of that candidate. Congress also limited the amount of money that registered political committees, these were groups that were created to consolidate donations to political candidates, how much they could give. It limited the amount that wealthy candidates could spend on their own elections. It also created extensive disclosure requirements, both for those who received money and for those who gave money. And it set up a system of public finance for campaigning to encourage candidates to rely upon public money rather than private donations. It also created a new federal agency, the Federal Elections Commission, to oversee all of this. In short, it was a comprehensive, expansive, and ambitious project of campaign finance regulation. Okay, so the constitutionality of FECA comes before the court as a First Amendment challenge. And the court, when it's trying to figure out whether this complies with the command of the First Amendment, has to essentially make up the rules that are going to apply. No rules existed at the time. This is because Congress hadn't, before the 1970s, enacted sweeping federal regulations of individual campaign contributions. And although since the beginning of the 20th century, both the states and the federal government had enacted laws that restricted how much corporations and somewhat later unions could donate to political campaigns, the court had never provided a good doctrinal reason for why these were constitutional under the First Amendment, although in prior decisions it had held that these were constitutional under the First Amendment. It is really amazing to read the early 20th century First Amendment cases on campaign finance laws because they are largely bereft of a good doctrinal explanation for what's going on. So the court that decided Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976 was writing on something like a clean slate. And just as Congress did when it enacted FECA, the court, writing on this slate, wrote quite ambitiously. So Buckley established 3 general propositions for the regulation of campaign finance that continue to be true today. Okay, Buckley continues to sort of establish the framework. Okay, so the first Buckley principle of campaign finance, principle number 1, that limits on how much individuals or corporations spend on candidate advocacy. And here I'm talking about both money you spend by giving directly to a campaign and money you spend independent of the campaign. These limits limit the amount of money that flow through the body politic and therefore trigger heightened scrutiny. Now, under the First Amendment. Now, people often criticize this principle, which they often associate with a much more recent campaign finance decision, Citizens United v. FEC, for holding that money equals speech, as the little illustration indicates. But in fact, the principle was first articulated in Buckley. Citizens United merely reaffirms it. And it doesn't, the claim here is not that money equals speech, but that in our mass society where speech is so often commodified, you have to pay money in order to have a political advertisement, you have to pay money in order to print a newspaper, you even have to pay money to get someone to hand out flyers very often, indicating your local political event. In this context, limits on the use of money to fund speech implicate the First Amendment. Okay, and so that's the first principle, very important. This explains why campaign finance laws are governed by First Amendment standards. The second principle from Buckley of campaign finance is that the government may enact campaign finance laws in order to prevent what the court called quid pro quo corruption, or in order to prevent Americans from believing that the American political system is corrupt. Okay. Now, the Buckley court recognized, in other words, that preventing corruption and preventing the appearance of corruption were compelling government interests under this heightened scrutiny that applied in First Amendment cases. And this is because it viewed both corruption and the appearance of corruption as existential threats to the well-being of democracy in the United States. As the court puts it, and these are excerpts from the opinion, to the extent that large contributions are given to secure a political quid pro quo from current and potential office holders, the integrity of our system of representative democracy is undermined. And the court also held that the avoidance of the appearance of improper influence, what are called quid pro quo corruption, is also critical if confidence in the system of representative government is not to be eroded to a disastrous extent. Note, by the way, the kind of existential crisis language. The court recognizes preventing corruption, preventing the appearance of corruption to be very, very serious problems, very, very serious government incentives or interests, given the threat posed to American democracy. So two is when we think about campaign finance law, we should really think, okay, this is an instrument to prevent corruption or the appearance of corruption, and these two obviously go hand in hand. But the third Buckley principle, and maybe the most controversial, is that the government may not enact campaign finance laws in order to equalize political access and influence. That is to say, in order to equalize or roughly equalize the ability of different members of the political community to use their money to influence the political process, to get politicians to listen to their demands, to help influence who gets elected. Now, this was one of the primary arguments that Congress made to justify FICA, but the court smacked it down in language that would launch 1,000 law review articles. The court said, the concept that government may restrict the speech of some elements of our society in order to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment. The First Amendment's protection against the governmental abridgment of free expression cannot properly be made to depend on a person's financial ability to engage in public discussion. Okay. Now, the Buckley court insisted, in other words, that, or read the equalizing justification as a kind of wealth discrimination in disguise. That the government, when it said it wants to equalize political access, political influence, is in fact targeting wealthier Americans who can contribute more, spend more money on political campaigns than poorer Americans, and viewed the First Amendment as prohibiting this kind of wealth discrimination. Now, there are all kinds of questions one can raise about this assertion, right? One might, in fact, I think I would, challenge this idea that limiting the ability of everybody to spend money on political campaigns is the same as discriminating against wealthy speakers, or I suppose, as the court puts it, denying wealthy speakers the First Amendment protection, right? Another way to understand what is happening is that speakers are simply not guaranteed a First Amendment right to spend more than others on political speech. So this claim that equality should have no role when it comes to, or equalization of influence should have no role when it comes to funding or motivating campaign finance laws, has proven quite controversial since the court articulated it in 1976. But although the court has in subsequent decisions vacillated on the point somewhat, and I'll talk about that a little bit further in the talk, the Roberts Court has proven to be very committed to this fundamental principle number 3 of Buckley v. Vallejo. The result is that today, when we discuss campaign finance laws, and certainly when we argue about campaign finance laws in court, the general presumption is that the proper way to think about these laws is as anti-corruption devices, rather than as equality-promoting devices. Okay. Now, Professor Stauss's argument, so that's just the background. That's the framework against which Professor Stauss was writing in 1976. So his argument is that this view of campaign finance law and what are the permissible, compelling government motivations for it was entirely backwards and upside down. That we should properly think of campaign finance laws primarily as mechanisms to secure equality, not as mechanisms of battling corruption or quid pro quo corruption. Professor Stauss argued quite provocatively that we should not necessarily think of using contributions to secure a political quid pro quo from a candidate. So you say, I'll give you $500 to fund your election ads. In advance, you have to agree to build the wall, or vote to deregulate my industry, something like that. We should not think about those as, in fact, corruption in the first place. We should not think that that's necessarily corrupt or anathema to democratic principles, although he does agree, I think, just to go back, I think he would agree that large contributions pose a problem for reasons I'll talk about in a second, but that ordinary contributions to secure a political quid pro quo do not necessarily undermine the integrity of our system of representative democracy. And the reason why, Professor Stauss argues, is that as opposed to garden variety political corruption, or what we might think of as bribery, say buying a politician or promising a politician that you're going to buy him a yacht in exchange for him promising to vote yes on a bill to deregulate your industry, campaign contributions do not enable politicians to exchange their political power for private pleasure. They do not, in that respect, involve the selling of political office. Instead, they enable politicians to exchange their political power for political speech, in this case, a political ad, for political organization, to fund campaign events, to hire organizers, to go out and leaflet or canvass in homes, which in turn is used to garner more votes. The money in campaign finance exchanges is exchanged for speech that is designed to garner other people's votes. So the money stays in the political system, right? The money doesn't end up as a yacht. The money ends up as ads that are encouraging people to vote. And Professor Stauss argues that, in fact, maybe this is not such a problem because this isn't the transformation of private money or public office into private pleasure. This is the transformation of public office into political speech. And surely this is something we want in a democracy for politicians to do, to expend resources, all kinds, both material, economic, and non-economic, to explain themselves and their politicians to voters. The result of viewing a quid pro quo campaign finance relationships in this way, Professor Stauss argues, is that even in the worst case scenario, even when someone gives to a politician's campaign, not just because they have faith in that politician, which is often why people donate to campaigns, right? You like the politician, you trust them, you like their background, you're trying to communicate a message about your political beliefs. But even when you act in a way that the Supreme Court has suggested is corrupt, that is to say, you condition the receipt of the money on a promise of the politician to do X, Y, and Z. Professor Stauss argues that we should view what is happening as the exchange of a promise to do something political for an increased chance of getting votes, right? Because that's what ads are trying to do. They're trying to increase the chance that a politician will get a lot of votes in the next election. And isn't that an essential part of how democracies function? That citizens all the time tell politicians, I will give you my vote if you do X, Y, and Z, if you fund Medicare for all, if you build the wall, if you withdraw all troops from Afghanistan. If you do that, if you promise to do that, I will vote for you. Okay? That's what we might think of as ordinary transactional democracy. You use one's own vote in exchange for political promises. This is how you influence and impact the political process. But we might think that quid pro quo corruption, at least on the view of it that Professor Stauss articulates, it's very, very similar. Instead of saying, I'm going to give you my vote in exchange for a political promise, you say, I'm going to give you an increased chance of getting other citizens' votes in exchange for a political promise. But the basic transactional logic of the exchange looks very similar. Professor Stauss argues that for this reason, there is nothing inherently troubling about this kind of quid pro quo relationship. In a world, or at least there is nothing troubling about such a relationship, in a world in which all citizens and perhaps all members of the political community have an equal capacity to engage in behavior of this kind. In fact, it might be good for democracy in a number of ways, okay, to allow this kind of quid pro quo corruption, in addition to the ordinary transactional democratic practice of exchanging one's vote in exchange for a political promise. Okay, so first and most obviously, if we allow a lot of this quid pro quo corruption to flower in our society, that is to say, we lift all limits on campaign finance, on campaign spending, we allow people to freely exchange money, promises of funding for campaigns in exchange for promises from politicians. So one thing that might happen is we would have just a profusion of political speech. A system in which this kind of behavior is encouraged is a system in which there is just going to be a lot of money flowing for political advertising, for political expression of all kinds. It would ensure that politicians have the funds to reach voters, to inform them of their views, to get them to vote, to mobilize, to do all those things. And if we understand the primary mechanism by which democracy functions, that is to say, the primary means by which the people in a democratic society govern themselves, to be the mechanism of speech, talking, debating, critiquing, arguing, invocating, all those things, then bargaining for political promises from candidates by funding their speech or other speech about them seems a better thing, seems to add more to the system than, for example, promising in private to vote for them if they do something, right? Promising in private doesn't really add to the total quantum of political speech out there in the system, whereas funding political advertising, political campaigns, political organizing does. Second, this second quid pro quo corruption kind of transactional democratic relationship allows members of the political community to ensure more precisely than they might otherwise be able to that politicians' behaviors actually align with their political preferences. This is because the vote is a very unclear signal of what a particular voter thinks or cares about. Okay, all you know when you vote, all the politician knows, I guess, when you vote for that politician is that compared to the other guy, you prefer this candidate for whatever reasons, right? And usually it's a mix of history, personality, charisma, and then the wide array of issues or concerns that they have articulated over the course of the campaign. But campaign contributions can much more precisely communicate what you like or do not like about the candidate. Okay, a contributor can make a legislator's reward depend precisely on the degree to which that legislature has taken positions of which the contributor approves. And in fact, we know, and I think this is one of the reasons we often feel uncomfortable about these kinds of relationships, that it's a much more intimate relationship when you're funding a campaign than when you are voting for a candidate. The vote is mediated through this impersonal institution of the ballot box and the precinct and the voting process. There's no intimate or direct relationship with the campaign. But when you give money to a candidate, or even when you give money to an organization that funds the candidate, all of a sudden you are meshed in a much richer set of political relationships and connections that allow you to communicate much more than you might otherwise be able to, exactly what you like or don't like about that candidate, exactly what you want or don't want from that candidate, and the same about the candidate against which they are running. And so we might think that if we want candidates to be sensitive to and responsive to voters' desires and demands, then allowing this kind of free-flowing transactional quid pro quo corruption, a system built around that will allow much more nuanced and tailored responsiveness. Third, allowing citizens to engage in even this kind of quid pro quo corruption allows members of the political community to register the intensity of their political preferences much more effectively. Okay, at the ballot box, you only have two options. You can vote yes or no, up or down. That's all. But assuming you have, for example, $100 to spend on a political campaign, you have at least 100 ways you can divide the money and more, but we don't need to focus on the cents. Okay, you can give a politician you really love all your money, or you can parcel it out in dribs and drabs to politicians about whom you feel less strongly, or you're more skeptical about their chances of winning, or because you have a tactical view about how to allocate the money. It allows the voter or the funder a lot more control and strategy, and therefore more ability to precisely communicate a whole range of views and preferences, including the intensity of preferences, than a system that simply depends upon the mechanism of the vote. So in a world in which we all have equal amounts of money to spend on political campaigns, Professor Stauss argues that campaign spending, or even quid pro quo corruption, and corruption here in quotes, because he's challenging the idea that this is corruption, he thinks it's not a bad thing, but it might in fact be a boon to democracy. Okay, so we might think it's just ordinary interest group politics, that lots of people are giving money to candidates, and they're all equally sized, they all have equal amounts of money, to say, I want you to do this thing. And the result is a responsive, continual back and forth between the voters and the candidates. It is only, Professor Stauss argues, under conditions of inequality, when some people have much more money to spend on political campaigns than others do, that we begin to worry that campaign spending distorts or corrupts or undermines electoral preferences by allowing some voices to speak more loudly than others. right? It is under these conditions that, in fact, allowing a free flow of campaign dollars into campaigns doesn't, in fact, look like ordinary interest group politics. It looks like a democratic problem. Okay, my technical slide capacities are not great, but this is meant to show one person with lots and lots of money overwhelming the ability of other people to participate or to express their preferences. Now, this fear that some, very few, but very powerful and very rich people will use their money to influence politicians to do their bidding in ways that others will not be able to do so. It is this fear that we might think really motivates legislative and popular concern with campaign spending, or at least, according to Professor Strauss's view, should. And as a historical matter, I think it is certainly true that it does. Indeed, if we look at the arguments that have been made over time to justify campaign finance laws, these arguments often talk about corruption, but the language of corruption often gets used or articulated to indicate problems of inequality, not just as a problem in itself. Okay, so if we look just all the way back to the first generation of campaign finance laws, and this comes from a wonderful article by David Cole called First Amendment Antitrust. David Cole writes, the first important calls for campaign finance reform came in the post-Civil War era and were addressed to the concentration of corporate wealth produced by the Industrial Revolution. When Congress enacted the first federal campaign finance regulations, its concern was quite plainly the systemic distorting effects caused by corporate wealth. Okay, note here, the focus on corporations is not necessarily because of an animus against corporations, but because of the view that corporations, because they're able to accumulate lots of different people's money, and they have all the advantages that come with the fact they're artificial rather than natural persons, are going to have much more money to spend on politicians than you and I, than ordinary natural persons. And Congress's principal concern was that corporations had undue influence as a result of their concentrated wealth. The regulatory impulse was part of a wider trend towards limiting the newfound power of corporations and setting some limits on wealth inequity in industrial America. If you look at the 19th and early 20th century debates, although they were replete with discussions about corruption and the threat to the integrity of the American political system, this is almost always tied not to the fact of quid pro quo per se, but to the fact that some actors, in particular these new trusts or powerful corporations, are going to have much more ability to engage in this kind of quid pro quo behavior than others. And in a famous speech from 1894, Elihu Root, the governor of New York, argued similarly that the purpose of campaign finance law was to prevent the great railroad companies, the great insurance companies, the great aggregations of wealth from using their corporate funds to send members of the legislature to vote for their protection and the advancement of their interests as against those of the public. Again, we see the concern here, inequality, rather than quid pro quo corruption per se. And it was precisely this concern that Congress invoked to justify the Federal Elections Campaign Act when it argued before the court in Buckley that the limits the act imposed were necessary to, quote, lessen the disproportionate advantage, the distorting effect of wealthy special interest groups on democratic politics, and thereby increase meaningful participation of ordinary citizens in the political process. Okay. Now, as I suggested earlier, let's go a little bit back. Even the opinion in Buckley itself indicates that the court is aware of this close connection between this fear of corruption and this problem of inequality. Because note, in explaining why quid pro quo corruptions threaten the integrity of the system of representative democracy, the court doesn't say to the extent that contributions are given to secure a political quid pro quo. It emphasizes the fact that it has to be large contributions are given to secure a political quid pro quo, suggesting that it's not just the fact of the quid pro quo, but it's the size of the quid pro quo, or the size of the contribution relative to the size of other participants that causes the problem. Now, despite hinting here, I think, at the possibility that a concern with the comparative size or wealth of donors might influence its thinking about the corruption justification itself, the court, as I noted earlier, utterly rejected the idea that equalizing political influence might be a constitutionally permissible justification under the First Amendment, okay? It says this concern is just wholly foreign to the First Amendment. It is anathema. And this is because, of course, it represents wealth discrimination. But Professor Strauss argues in his article that this is just the wrong way to think about the justification, and it is the wrong way to think about the First Amendment. And this is because, or we can see this if we look at the equal protection principle of one person, one vote. Okay. Okay. So in a case called Reynolds v. Sims in 1964, the court held that wildly malapportioned voting districts violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because the concept of we the people under the Constitution, this is from the opinion, visualizes no preferred class of voters, but it visualizes equality among those who meet the basic qualifications. And the court then added, how can one person be given twice or 10 times the voting power of another person in a statewide election merely because he lives in a rural area or because he lives in the smallest rural county? Once the geographical unit for which a representative is to be chosen is designated, all who participate in the election are to have an equal vote, whatever their race, whatever their sex, whatever their occupation, whatever their income, and whatever their income, and wherever their home may be in that geographical unit. Surely, Professor Strauss argues, the same principle that the court applies when it comes to influencing electoral outcomes by voting should also apply when it comes to influencing electoral outcomes by means other than voting. How can one person, and here I'm just paraphrasing from Reynolds v. Sims, how can one person have 10 times the ability to influence the conduct of elections simply because they happen to make someone more than someone else? Or they happen to have made better stock picks in their life, or they come from a wealthier family, they happen to have wealthier parents. Doesn't this also violate a basic principle of democratic society, namely that however unequal the people may be when it may come to their economic status or their social status, when it comes to their political status, they are all equal participants in the shared venture of creating a democratic society? So this suggests that, and this is where Professor Strauss ends up, like laws against malapportionment in voting, laws that limit the amount of money spent on political campaigns should primarily be understood as mechanisms for guaranteeing the fundamental political equality that a democracy requires in order to survive, not primarily as mechanisms for routing out quid pro quo corruption. So Professor Strauss argues, in other words, that our campaign finance cases get it backwards, get it upside down. They are completely wrong in how they view and understand campaign finance laws. Now, one can have all kinds of objections to that, and I'm curious to hear your reactions in the comments, in the Q&A. And some of these objections Professor Strauss anticipated himself. So one might argue, for example, that even if all Americans were in fact equal, there might still be very serious problems. We might have very serious objections to unlimited campaign spending. So for one thing, we might just not want a system in which votes, either one's own votes or other people's votes, are traded for promises. We might think it is better for voters to elect candidates who will make choices for themselves. Okay, we might have a vision of representative democracy, which understands that it is really important for the integrity of the system for elected representatives to be free to exercise judgment. And that the bluntness of the signal that votes communicate in this respect and the attenuated relationship they create with politicians, we might think that's an advantage. Because even if politicians clearly are going to make policy decisions based on their view of what voters are going to want, and therefore are going to be limited in their ability to exercise discretion, it's going to only happen in a very attenuated and blunt way, leaving there to be a lot of room for politicians to make choices about all kinds of things that maybe voters aren't going to pay attention to, or is just are going to be outweighed in the mix when it comes to the ballot box. And in comparison, we might think that the kind of much more nuanced form of influence that political spending allows, as I talked about earlier, is going to constrain politicians to a much greater degree than they might otherwise be. Relatedly, we might think that a system of unregulated spending will leave politicians having to make political decisions solely by triangulating between competing, selfish, special interests, rather than by thinking of the general public good. Okay, so even if we might think that somehow we were able to be all equal, there are all these problems with unregulated spending. Now, as Professor Strauss notes in his article, we might think this, but this view that the elected representatives should have a lot of leeway to make decisions based on the public good rather than their commitments, their promises to voters or donors, rests on a pretty contestable view of how democracy functions, one which presumes that absent the spur of the promise, the spur of the sort of a check of the voters' desires or campaign donations, politicians would think about the public good rather than about propping up the status quo or getting reelected. Now, after all, even if we were to limit campaign spending, it's not as if there aren't opinion polls that politicians would clearly pay attention to that would allow politicians to gauge voter desires and accommodate them. So although a system of unregulated campaign spending, we might think, even in a society which is generally equal, is going to intensify or exacerbate this kind of conflictual, special interest, transactional nature of democratic society, we might think that democracy is generally transactional. And it's a complicated question how to balance the benefits of allowing or forcing politicians to be responsive to popular desires against the costs of doing so, the cost to their independent judgment. And we have certainly seen in recent years how contributions to insurgent campaigns, how political money can actually be used in a very powerful and useful way to push candidates or push the political system to be responsive to demands and desires from the people that it might not otherwise be. Right. And we might think that in pushing the system, the voters, in enacting these promises, forcing politicians to comply with their desires, they are exerting their voice and their money to shape the view of what the public interest requires in a useful and beneficial and certainly democratic way. Now, alternatively, you might argue that even if money is evenly distributed in our society, having so much money flowing through the political system would be a problem. Okay, so we may think that even leaving aside equality, there's an independent justification for campaign finance laws, which is we just don't want there to be so much money in politics. It doesn't matter really how it is distributed. The sheer bulk of the money is a problem. It is wasteful. It means that voters are subjected to endless, often quite misleading political advertising. And of course, it requires politicians to spend an inordinate amount of time fundraising. Now, I think this is actually a very good argument for why we might want to have campaign finance law. And it is an argument that does not sound in corruption and it doesn't sound in equality. It sounds in efficiency and the costs of the system on the humans who are participants in it. But this argument for campaign finance regulations, I think, ultimately only supplements rather than undermines the case that Professor Stauss makes in his argument for thinking about campaign finance laws as mechanisms of equality or equalization. This is because realistically, in the society in which we live, which is a profoundly unequal society, absent really radical and revolutionary change in our tax structure or our underlying economic structure, the only way in which you could have voters be made, or members of the political community be made roughly equal in their ability to donate to political campaigns, is by imposing pretty strict limits on the amount of money that individuals can contribute to campaign speech. The result being to, on the whole, limit the amount of money flowing through the system as a whole, therefore alleviating these other concerns. And so it means that this suggests that a nice side effect of thinking about campaign finance laws as an equalizing device is to lower the temperature of the system as a whole, to limit the amount of money flowing, limit the amount of waste, limit the amount of fundraising. Now, finally, we could argue that campaign finance laws are not, we cannot make the equivalent between the voting cases and the campaign finance cases, because guaranteeing equality when it comes to speech or campaign finance is a much trickier proposition than guaranteeing equality when it comes to voting. One person, one vote seems like a relatively easy principle to apply, but it's hard to figure out exactly what the quantum should be when it comes to campaign finance. How much money can people spend? How do you ensure that there is genuine equality and the ability to influence and affect politicians? And Professor Stauss makes an argument of the sort himself in his article. He argues that although Reynolds v. Sims suggests that the court in Buckley got it wrong in theory, in practice, the gerrymandering cases, cases exploring how, in fact, to make the one person, one vote principle real, That is to say, to not allow politicians to apportion districts in a way that in practice render some voters more powerful than others. So the court has struggled a lot with how to guarantee this. And the results suggest that, in fact, although in principle, a theory of equality is nice, in practice, enforcing equality, particularly in a political system where the actors making the ground rules are incumbents who have a vested interest in creating forms of inequality that are going to serve their interests, this is actually a very difficult thing to do. And I agree completely that efforts to restrict political gerrymandering and the problem of political gerrymandering shows how tricky and how constant a struggle it is to guarantee political equality in a democratic society like our own. But I think that this doesn't, this doesn't undermine the primary argument, which is that we should think about, justify campaign finance laws as equality promoting devices. I think it only, in fact, emphasizes the importance of this. Because when it comes to political gerrymandering cases or political gerrymandering, there seems to me no question that neither under the First Amendment nor under the Equal Protection Clause would the court view the federal constitution as standing in the way of, say, a federal law that created independent state commissions to apportion districts in the various states in an effort to prevent partisan gerrymandering. Okay. Now, although in recent cases the court has rejected the view that either the Equal Protection Clause or the First Amendment require the courts to themselves invalidate what look like partisan gerrymandered district maps, the court has not gone so far as to say that Congress or the states don't have the power to enact laws to prevent political gerrymandering on their own account. Okay. And yet, I think the general view would be that this would be a very good thing because it would promote fundamental principles of equality and democracy that sound in both the Equal Protection and the First Amendment cases. Okay, but since Buckley, in sharp contrast, the First Amendment has been understood to impose a very significant restriction on the ability of either the federal or the state governments to enact campaign finance laws, even though we might think that they're doing exactly the same thing as the anti-gerrymandering laws to the similar kinds of purposes. And this is in large part because of the court's insistence that these kinds of laws must be justified by an increase in stamping out corruption, narrowly defined to mean quid pro quo corruption. Now, as Professor Stauss's argument makes clear, there is just no good reason to interpret the First Amendment to bar campaign finance laws that are designed to equalize citizens' access to and influence over politicians, or at least there's no reason to treat campaign finance laws that try to do this differently from laws that try and limit the ability of politicians to gerrymander districts to preserve their incumbency advantage. The two are strictly parallel efforts. And if in both cases the court might resist the view that the First Amendment or the 14th Amendment require these laws, it's very difficult to see why in the one case the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment prohibit these kinds of laws or constrain them, whereas they do not in the other. Now, none of this is to say that courts should give a free pass anytime a legislature enacts what it calls a campaign finance law in the name of equalization. Okay, these kinds of laws are tricky. They pose all kinds of questions. So, for example, you could imagine if a campaign finance law sets the level of spending that all participants in the political system are allowed to spend too low, it can serve as a mechanism of incumbency protection. Either it might be motivated to protect the political fortunes of the incumbents, or it might have that effect by making it harder for outsider candidates to challenge politicians who have a lot of name recognition. Now, I should note that in an era of small donor financing, where we've seen the real power of accumulations of really small dollar donations, this is a less pressing concern when it comes to campaign finance regulation than I think it once was. I think the internet enables there to be a lot of power in small dollar donations, but it certainly is something that courts should be concerned about. And similarly, when thinking about campaign finance laws, we should pay attention to the possibility that these laws, including public financing systems, might exacerbate political inequality and defend the status quo by privileging the major parties against outsider parties and by privileging party candidates against independent candidates. This was, in fact, a very serious concern with the system of public financing established by FICA and addressed in the Buckley v. Vallejo case, although it is a concern that the Buckley court, perhaps understandably, totally brushed aside. Okay, the Buckley court was not worried about equality, and so was not terribly worried about the inequality promoting effects of public financing laws that give a significantly greater dollar amount to the established parties than to others, and that route a lot of the permitted money through the established two-party channels and committees. Okay, if we think about campaign finance laws through the prism of equality, all of a sudden public financing schemes that privilege the major two parties start to look a lot more difficult, more complicated than the Buckley court thought they might be. On the other hand, limits on contributions and expenditures, limits on the amount of money you can give to campaigns or you can spend on election-related speech, suddenly start to look somewhat less problematic because these can serve to equalize political influence. So, but on the whole, though, Professor Stauss's argument, although it makes, it should not be taken to say we should rubber stamp or close our eyes anytime the state or federal legislatures try and enact campaign finance laws, it does suggest that we should not penalize them or understand the First Amendment to penalize the legislature for attempting to equalize political access and influence. To the contrary, we should recognize this as a primary purpose of this kind of legislation. And I should add, although this is really my view, my voice rather than Professor Stauss's, that if we understand the First Amendment to be primarily about guaranteeing the conditions under which democracy can occur and maintain itself in America, that is to say, as guaranteeing the kind of information environment that is required for the democratic people to be able to govern themselves, then we should understand this kind of equalizing purpose of the campaign finance laws not to be, as the Buckley court insisted, anathema to the First Amendment, but itself a First Amendment aim, or something extremely consistent with the broader democracy-promoting aims of the First Amendment. Now, were courts to understand campaign finance laws in this way, it would represent a profound transformation of the First Amendment law of campaign finance. Professor Stauss's article was published soon after Buckley v. Vallejo was handed down. It was, or I guess 20 years after Buckley v. Vallejo was handed down, but a long time before Citizens United. And so could not predict the developments. And in fact, at the time Professor Stauss was writing, the court was vacillating quite a lot in its corporate campaign finance cases about how to think about equality. And just as we saw in the early 20th century, concerns about inequality were often wrapped up in concerns about the use of the role that corporations were playing in campaign financing. In a case in the early 1990s, the court suggested that the Buckley principle might not apply when it comes to regulations of corporate campaign spending, I think in part because these concerns with inequality just would not go away. But the Roberts Court has rejected that and continued to, or embraced with a renewed fervor since the early 2000s, the principle that efforts to equalize political access and influence are anathema to the First Amendment. But the courts clearly are not agreeing with Professor Stauss's argument, but I think that we should recognize that there may be something fundamentally misguided about the conventional wisdom in the First Amendment cases about what campaign finance laws are supposed to do and what they are prohibited from doing. Okay, so I've spoken for a long time. I would love to hear questions and comments, thoughts.
Hi, Professor. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just start with one that's closer to home. So in India, there was recently an electoral bonds case where the Supreme Court said it's okay to have anonymous contributions for electoral bonds. So that means you can fund a political campaign anonymously. That's the crux of it. So how do you think that would fit in this sort of First Amendment and anti-corruption tension that you've highlighted through these cases?
So yeah, anonymity is actually a very complicated question because it cuts against the kinds of arguments I was making. Because of course, anonymous donations make it harder to ensure that campaign spending is equal. So one of the implications of the kind of argument I was articulating earlier is that we need to have pretty good regulation of who is spending and how much they are spending in order to ensure equality. Now, of course, disclosure to the government is different than disclosure to the public. So in general, the First Amendment cases, and I'm sympathetic to this, give pretty strong protection to anonymous speech because they recognize that anonymity can be a condition, can be a speech enhancing precondition, right? Like if you know that people don't know who you are, you may be freer to be able to say what you really think. So we might think that there are really good speech enhancing consequences of anonymity. But a concern with equalization will require a certain amount of disclosure in order to ensure that there's, I think that really one of the huge challenges in campaign finance laws is preventing secret workarounds, right? Or it's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole. You can create nice equality rules. There will be efforts to evade them, and then the government will have to regulate in response. And so I think it does suggest that a fully anonymous system of donations is going to be a problem under this approach. I'll come back to you if you have more questions, but Alex?
Thanks, Professor. I guess my question is really similar to Divya's. I know that the Supreme Court has recently heard cases on disclosure and anonymity in the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. And I guess it makes me think about the social and reputational role or the sunlight disinfectant role, both for corruption, but also limiting outside speech. It seems like some donors may face a reputational backlash if they have outsized campaign donations. And I don't know if that's exactly the issue that's at stake at the Supreme Court right now, but it's something that it reminds me of. And so if there isn't going to necessarily be laws that specifically limit things, there's sort of a social alternative. And I guess I'm wondering what the implications are for the ideas that you've discussed or how these things come together.
That's interesting. I mean, so on one view, right, the view you were suggesting, if we can't get equality promoting laws, then we should use social sanctions to get people to act in ways that are not egregious. So I suppose the view here is that if the Koch brothers give too much to certain politicians, there's going to face reputational sanctions. So maybe it's not obvious to me, and it is true that, for example, corporate donations are scrutinized quite heavily, and we can see that corporations are quite sensitive to political changes and political attitudes when it comes to giving to politicians. And so social sanctions might play a really important role in the system. On the other hand, I think we have to recognize the very serious cost that the lack of anonymity can produce, particularly when it comes to giving support to an outsider candidate. So, for example, say you're a Bernie supporter, but all your family thinks that he's a crazy socialist. If you can give anonymously, it seems much more likely that you are going to be able to give than if you know that you're going to be teased about it at the dinner party every Sunday night. And so anonymity, I do think, even if we, or maybe especially if we really care about equalizing political voice, seems to be an important component of continues to have a sort of important role to play in the system as a whole, even if it is complicated by this requirement for the government to have a certain amount of disclosure. And certainly, if we want to allow people to participate in the political system, I mean, one of the things about the form of liberal democracy that we embrace in this country is addressed on a separation between sort of this rich terrain of inequality, which is ordinary social life, and the political sphere. We want people to be equal in the political sphere, even if they're unequal or constrained in all these ways, in other parts of life. Anonymity is one way to ensure that. So in your private life, there might be strong social norms to push you to vote according to the way your husband votes, or vote the way your community votes, to give in to sort of collective pressure. Anonymity enables you, one way to think about it is enables the voter to stand on their own 2 feet and to be equal to anyone else and to say, no, this is really what I think, this is who I want to vote for. So I am very wary of sunlight laws when it comes to voting or when it comes to political campaign contributions.
Do the same issues persist if there's an anonymity threshold, meaning below a certain amount you can remain anonymous, but a certain egregious threshold you sort of choose to expose yourself to the public and any scrutiny?
Well, so one of the implications, I think, of the argument that Professor Stauss was articulating, that we should think about campaign finance laws as equality promoting laws rather than corruption promoting laws, is that it changes our view of trigger campaign regulations. So in its jurisprudence, the court has been very skeptical, very hostile to laws that say, well, these are the rules if you spend a certain amount. But if you go above that, then the rules start to look different, because it is said correctly that if the only thing we're worrying about is quid pro quo corruption or the appearance, it's hard to justify these kinds of trigger mandates. They look like they're doing something else. And that is true. What they're doing is they're trying to promote equality in the system. So if we suddenly have a view that, no, actually, that's what we're trying to do. We are trying to promote equality of political access and influence. Trigger laws suddenly look much less problematic. And so perhaps in that view, we might think one of the triggers could be not just that your opponent gets, say, somehow more public finance dollars or something else happens. You have to give more disclosures, but you can no longer be anonymous as a donor. That seems like a plausible argument to me. But again, there are costs to getting rid of anonymity, so we're going to have to really think carefully about the pros and the cons. But sure, maybe that's interesting. Any other questions?
So I just wanted to clarify this aspect that you pointed out between, like, the goal of equality and the goal of the First Amendment. So if we have a law, like say you have scholarships for people, you give them money based on their needs and based on merit. Suppose we have a similar regulation by the government that says everyone needs to spend a fixed amount on elections. And if you have needs, like say you have these citizen organizations that try to bring ordinary candidates, like AOC's campaign, to sort of bring them up to competition with these more established candidates. So would that be justifiable under the goal of equality? Or would the court say that, no, this is the wrong kind of equalization under the Buckley principles?
You mean because we're trying to equalize the political candidates?
Yeah, by saying everyone needs to spend a fixed amount. And if you have needs to meet that threshold, then we'll help you as the government. Kind of like a government aid structure. Like I'm kind of questions together, but yeah.
So of course, political equality is supposed to be the equality of people to participate in the choice of selecting candidates. It shouldn't mean, and I think the court has rejected this, but I'm more sympathetic to the court's rejection of this. It shouldn't mean that all candidates are treated equally in all respects. So, for example, when the court was dealing with the public financing scheme that the Congress set up, it pointed out that surely it cannot be, this was in response to this challenge, this inequality challenge brought by minor parties, it surely cannot be that the Congress has to fund equally the candidate who has no chance of winning an election and the candidate who has a very good chance. That seems like a waste of public dollars. It seems like taking an equality principle too far, when in part of the whole point of the political process is to discriminate, is to choose, I prefer this to this, which obviously is going to result in inequality. One candidate is going to be president, one candidate is not. And so efforts to produce equal results among major and minor party candidates or independent and important candidates seem like a problem. On the other hand, yes, we might think that public financing schemes are really tricky to design because they often have an incumbency or major party advantaging effect. And we should take that seriously, that in the name of trying to get money out of politics, we might in fact be simply giving a boon to the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and hurting the Greens, for example. Now, there have been some municipalities that have tried to do something about this. So, for example, Seattle has a voucher system in which all registered voters get a certain amount of money that they can spend on the candidate of their choice. And by routing the the public financing to the voters rather than the politicians, it's a way of avoiding having to privilege the major party candidates over the minor parties. So on your scenario, that means that if the Seattle voters really like the AOC candidate, even though she's never won, let's go back in time to a period before she had won her first election, even if she's never won, she's suddenly getting a lot of public financing dollars because that's what the voters want. And there isn't the same incumbency advantage. So I think public financing laws can be designed in a way that doesn't create these inequality problems, but that in order to do so, you have to recognize that the equalizing of influence is the primary thing we're trying to do with our campaign finance scheme. It's not primarily about getting rid of quid pro quo corruption. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but the Seattle law, it wouldn't pose an issue under the Supreme Court's principles if it was challenged.
I think it's unclear. I think it's unclear because I think it might, because again, whether or not that law is a good way of routing out quid pro quo corruption or its appearance is in question. by narrowing the range of permissible justifications that the government can invoke in order to defend campaign finance laws that restrict the total amount of money spent on the election, the court just makes it difficult to justify campaign finance regulations in general.
Professor, the last question. Do you think the courts created a repugnancy between the First Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause by this kind of holding?
Do I think the courts weren't?
Do you think the courts created a repugnancy between the First Amendment and the EPC by this kind of holding?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, there are a lot of parallels between the First Amendment jurisprudence and the Equal Protection jurisprudence, but there are a lot of similarities in the court's approach, the sort of tiers of scrutiny, the court's insistence on formal equality, anti-classificatory laws. So the court in its First Amendment cases, it hates sort of content-based classifications, just like in its equal protection cases, it hates race-based classifications and it treats them similarly. There are a lot of parallels. But yes, if you look at Reynolds v. Sims versus Buckley v. Vallejo, they seem like diametrically opposite views of the relationship of the government to these goals of equalization or equality, democratic equality. And so I think there is a very serious tension created between the campaign finance cases, which say, no, equality is anathema to the First Amendment, and the equal protection cases, which say, no, the fundamental goal of the federal constitution and its rights guarantee is to ensure the fundamental political equality of all citizens. And of course, what the court would say in Buckley is that, no, we were, Professor Lakier, Professor Stauss, you got it all wrong. We're actually the equality committed court because we were really worried about wealth discrimination. And so there is a way in which the Buckley court, I think, itself thinks that it is promoting the ends of equality because the law, FICA, was in its purpose, if not in its form, trying to discriminate against wealthy people. But I just reject that framing. FICA gave equal ability of all participants, all citizens, to contribute to political campaigns. The fact that it had a disparate effect on very wealthy Americans as opposed to very poor Americans doesn't mean necessarily it was wealth discrimination. It means that this is one of the consequences of what it means to be equal. It's just the same as saying, well, Reynolds v. Sims was discriminating against people who happen to live in very sparsely populated districts, because all of a sudden it's taking away from them a kind of political power that they otherwise weren't, that they otherwise would have enjoyed. But I think on that view, we think, well, they weren't entitled to that kind of political power. Similarly, in a democratic system, I think we would think, well, individuals are not entitled to translate the economic power that they have, the wealth that they have in the economic sphere, without constraint into the political realm, because the political realm is supposed to be a realm of equality. The economic realm is not. Matthew, last question.
Yeah, that's kind of a nice transition into what I wanted to ask, which is, so I'm wondering about how this kind of, some of the equalizing principles that you talked about here would play with forms of speech where the political impact that speech has is intrinsically tied to the wealth of the person speaking, but there's no expenditures of wealth that are necessary to do the speaking, the act of speaking. So I'm thinking of Twitter, right? I'm sure that there's some significant correlation between a person's number of Twitter followers and their wealth. But the act of sending out a tweet requires no expenditures. And so you could imagine this kind of trade-off where, I'll tweet something that's going to be very favorable to you if you do something for me, but there's no, it doesn't seem like there would be a campaign finance problem, but it's very unequal in the sense that becomes way more attractive the more followers you have, and probably the more wealth you have.
Yeah.
So how would this idea play there?
Great. That is a great question. And actually, it expands a little bit on Alex's question about anonymity and how it interacts with sort of social sanctions. So, and it allows me actually to conclude on this note, which I do want to communicate, which is that campaign finance laws can surely not be the only mechanism of ensuring equality, or they're not a sufficient mechanism for ensuring equality in a society that is so unequal as our own is. That even if you equalize the amount of money that people can spend on elections, it doesn't mean you're equalizing political influence, or you're equalizing political power in a sort of broad sense. Because of course we understand that the political influence, political power arise from all kinds of causes. It's not simply the ability to contribute to a campaign that does it. And you're right, celebrity gives you political power. wealth gives you political power. Having a high institutional position in industry gives you political power. None of this will be affected by a law like the law that the court struck down in Buckley v. Vallejo that imposed very significant limits on the ability of individuals to engage in expenditures, that is to say, to fund election-related speech independent of a campaign. We might think that that's promoting equality, but it's not ensuring that everyone is equal by no means. But all of which is to say, I suppose, that this is just one of the tactics that the government can and should use if we are really committed to this project of political equality. But if we are committed to a project of political equality in a society that is socially unequal, economically unequal, politically unequal in all these ways, then we have to think about it as requiring lots and lots of different tactics on the part of the government and ordinary citizens. So we might think the tax system is an important site of attack. The campaign finance laws are one mechanism, but it doesn't exhaust the problem by any means. So thank you for asking that. So I guess I would say, yeah, the fact that someone's tweet has more influence than another person's tweet may be because nothing to do with the inherent quality of the tweet, but just because they're famous or they're wealthy. We might think that's a problem when we are thinking about political influence, but it's not a campaign finance problem. It might be a democratic problem that the democratic people have to think about a solution to. But campaign finance is trying to do a particular thing. It's an important thing, but it's only part of a larger problem, which is how do you ensure political equality in a society organized around profound and pervasive inequality? All right, thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I hope everyone's well, and I guess I will say goodbye now.